Hello everyone, welcome to the first official episode of our hopefully ongoing series on the history of English literature. My name is Dr. Arash Rahmani, and today we will be talking about the Anglo-Saxon period and its literature. If you're not certain what this series is all about, I recommend that you go and watch the introductory video I published a few days ago. That should give you a general idea of what you can expect. But because we have a lot to cover today, I'm not going to go into detail about what the series is about. And I'm just going to start my presentation by talking about the Anglo-Saxon period. So if you're ready, just let's begin our presentation. As you can see here, the period that we are going to talk about kind of spans over 800 years, and it initiates in the 5th century and continues up until the Renaissance and, of course, the Reformation. Basically, what I'm talking about is the medieval period and the Middle English period, but this span of 800 years includes three distinctive historical periods, which we will cover in three different videos. So before we talk about any of them, we have to keep in mind that each one of these three different categories has its own unique literature, its own unique historical, political, and social issues. And that's why we have decided to divide them into these three different subsections. So I will talk about them later on, but I just wanted you to know that the period that we are covering just encompasses 800 years, so we have a lot to talk about. And before we go any further, I just want to do a shout out to the Norton Anthology of English Literature, which is like a world-trusted source on the history of English literature. So if you want to go deeper into the characteristic features of each period, as well as the magnificent works of literature produced in each period, I recommend that you buy the books for your personal reading. So let's talk about the Middle Ages. When we talk about the Middle Ages, we have to keep this in mind that there are certain keywords that we have to know about. So, as we said, the Middle Ages is like a temporal expanse which spans approximately 800 years, and it begins in the 5th century and continues until the Renaissance and the Reformation. So it's imperative for us to define some of the keywords I just told you. The Middle Ages and what it means, the Renaissance and what it means, and of course the Reformation. These are the three most important keywords that we have to define right at the beginning of our presentation. Let's talk about the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages signifies a time frame or a period from the fall of the Roman Empire to the advent of the Renaissance. And it served as a fertile ground for the flourishing of art, literature, and science, all deeply entrenched in the Christian culture of the period. Yes, of course, we have the pagan culture as well, but most of the works which have been preserved for us that tell us and show us what those periods looked like have been preserved because of the Christian culture and because most of the publications in this period were done by the church. So the term medieval itself, which is usually applied to this period, acts as an adjective that denotes all of the creations originating in this era, which of course once again underscores the cultural and intellectual richness of a period that is often neglected, especially in comparison to the Renaissance. The other important keywords for us to talk about at this stage, as you can see here, is of course the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance characterizes an era marked by a surge in creativity, earning it the epithet of a rebirth of culture. Now, it originated in the 14th and 15th century Italy, and this period, as I said, saw a resurgence of Latin and Greek learning and literature. Now, the term itself, the term Renaissance, was not used by Renaissance men themselves. It was a term which was coined by 19th century scholars and historians, and this term aptly encapsulates the intellectual and cultural uh, richness of this epoch. And of course, when it spread to other different parts of Europe, because as we said, it began in Italy, but immediately spread to all different parts of Europe. And finally, the third critical term that we have to talk about is the Reformation right now. So, the Reformation designates a potent religious movement commencing in the early 16th century. Now, this movement vehemently contested the supreme authority of the Roman Catholic Church. And understanding these three pivotal keywords will lay the foundation for our comprehensive analysis of this 800-year expanse when we delve deeper into them in this video and of course in the future videos which I will publish on a weekly basis, hopefully. So when we are talking about the literature, like the first official period in the history of English literature, we are actually talking about its history from the fall of the Roman Empire up until the Renaissance and of course the Reformation. So once again, I cannot emphasize this enough. For convenience sake, we have divided this 800-year period into three different sections. And as you can see here, they are called the Anglo-Saxon period, the Anglo-Norman period, and of course the Middle English period and their literatures. So let's talk about them one by one. So this historical epoch, as previously noted, comprises three distinct sections. The initial segment, denominated Anglo-Saxon period and literature, commences with the conquest of Britain around 450. Now, this phrase is chiefly characterized by Old English. So when we say Anglo-Saxon literature, we are talking about Old English literature, which of course has its roots in Germanic languages and culture. So it has Germanic origins. And the subsequent sections, which we will get to in future videos, the Anglo-Norman period, it started with the Norman conquest of 1066, and the most important group of people who lived in this period were the Normans, who were completely fluent in French, and they exerted dominance, great dominance over substantial regions of Britain, and they contributed significantly to the English language by lending them a lot of jargons and vocabulary. It's also important to note that a very important facet of this era is the prevalence of romances, particularly those centered around King Arthur, thus giving rise to what is colloquially known as the King Arthur mania. So most of the King Arthur romances that we have uh, originated in this Anglo-Norman period. And the culmination of this temporal continuum, which expands for 800 years, is what we call the Middle English period, and of course its corresponding literature. Now, this spans the 14th and 15th centuries, and it was a pivotal juncture in the emergence of English literature as a national literature. Now, there was a king in this period called Edward III, and Edward declared war on France. Now, this conflict instigated a burgeoning sense of national identity among the English populace, and it fostered a resolve to cultivate their own language and literature, which was, of course, distinct from Latin or French and other European languages. So, in essence, these three subsections collectively delineate the developmental trajectory of this historical epoch, which we will talk about in a matter of few videos, which will be published subsequently. So, as I said, today we're only concerned with the first period. And the first period is called the Anglo-Saxon literature. Let's talk about it in greater details. Now, when we talk about the Anglo-Saxon period, well, it's one of the earliest periods in the history of English literature. Now, when we are talking about it, we have to talk about like the first century until the fifth century when the Germanic populations actually invaded Britain. So, as you can see here, from the first century to the fifth century, England was a province of the Roman Empire, and it was called Britannia because of the people who were living there. Now, these people were called Britons, as you can see here, and they were Celtic speaking people. And that's why the name Britannia, that's where the name Britannia comes from. Now, as we said, during this epoch, uh, as I mentioned, the Germanic conquest happened around 450, which is like the 5th century. And suddenly we have this dominance of Germanic tradition and languages in this period. Most of these Germanic people who attacked England and conquered Britain, uh, consisted of three different tribes: the Angles, the Saxons, and of course the Jutes. So these were the people who basically uh, attacked Britain, and they kind of dominated the whole region and produced the literature, which was, of course, very, very specific to their culture. Now, when we are talking about the Anglo-Saxon period, we have to talk about the significance of religion in this period. Now, during this epoch, religion assumed a pivotal role. The Britons, as I said, they had embraced Christianity in the 4th century, and they were mostly influenced by their emperor called Constantine, who converted to Christianity. And they continued their adherence to this faith, even like under the Roman rule. However, so following the Anglo-Saxon conquest in 450, Christianity kind of experienced a decline for almost 150 years, and it only persisted in remote regions which were inaccessible to the Anglo-Saxons. So when the Germanic tribes invaded Britain, before that, they had embraced Christianity, but after the Anglo-Saxon invasion, Christianity was only practiced in the remote regions of Britain, which were not like accessible to the Anglo-Saxons. In a significant turning point around the year like 597, and of course the subsequent decades, these Germanic conquerors of England also embraced Christianity once more. So this resurgence of Christian influence markedly impacted literacy in the region. While Anglo-Saxon poetry primarily existed in the oral tradition, the advent of the written records emerged during this period, and the impetus for this development came from King Ethelbert, who was the first English Christian monarch and who mandated the documentation of certain laws, thus providing the earliest written specimens of Old English written documents. And this manifestation of written culture was a direct consequence of the resurgence of Christianity, underscoring its profound impact on enhancing the literacy of the populace. Now, transitioning to this new facet, it is imperative to note that Christianity not only spurred the recording of laws, but also prompted the publication of the first book of laws in England. Now, this milestone, initiated by the Christian king, marked a noteworthy advancement in the codification of legal principles and further solidified the influence of Christianity on the literary landscape of the Anglo-Saxon period. As we said, during this period, religion played a significant role. Now, we have to talk about some of these people. During this era, England and Britain witnessed the emergence of numerous clergymen, people who were associated with the church. And Bede was actually one of the most preeminent figures among them. Now, Bede authored a renowned work called The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. It is a seminal narrative recounting the conversion of the people and, of course, the evolution of the English church. It was completed in 1731, and this book holds paramount significance for us as a key source of information regarding this historical epoch. Now, as previously mentioned, individuals who initially invaded England in the 5th century were of Germanic lineage. By the 9th century, these invaders who had transformed their faith, who had turned into Christian Anglo-Saxons, were once again the target of another attack from subsequent invaders, the Danes, again with Germanic roots. And so these people were kind of attacked by the Danes in the 9th century. These attacks, characterized by attacks on monasteries, including Bede's own monastery, had a lasting impact on the historical narratives that have survived. The repercussions of such raids were notably felt in the 10th century specifically, which of course inspired the composition of one of the most important books of the period, the Battle of Maldon, which is the final work of Old English heroic poem from this era. So this work is extremely significant for us. The Battle of Maldon is the last of the English heroic poems, and it's significant for us. So you have to memorize that name. So the Danes were really, really powerful, and they exerted dominance over significant portions of Britain, particularly the northern regions of it, and they posed a substantial threat to the overall control of the island. However, we have an extremely important figure in this period, King Alfred, who emerged to thwart their advance. Reigning from 1871 to 1899 as the king of the West Saxons, Alfred successfully unified the kingdoms of southern England for a period. Noteworthy for his active governance, King Alfred also distinguished himself as an enthusiastic patron of literature. And as you can see here, and I've underlined them for you, his literary contributions extended to the translations from Latin, the most notable of which was Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, which is a 6th century Roman work that centuries later, I apologize, Geoffrey Chaucer also translated in the 14th century. Alfred's patronage likely extended to the translation of Bede's history as well, further underlining his role in the shaping of the literary landscape and literary prose. And additionally, Alfred played a pivotal role in the production of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So as you can see, he was such a central figure in this period, and he helped write or translate some of the most important works of the period. Now, we have to talk about, like at this stage in our presentation, we have to delve into the distinctive features of Old English poetry by shedding light on the essence of this literary form. The Anglo-Saxon invaders, let me just show you the presentation as well. Okay, we're good to go. So the Anglo-Saxon invaders had an oral tradition, and they brought with them a rich legacy of oral poetry, though, of course, the specifics of it remain elusive to us due to the predominant oral nature of communication among them. So, unfortunately, because not a lot of what they talked about and what they produced has been preserved, we don't really know much about the kind of literature that they liked or the kind of culture that they had. Also important to talk about, especially with regards to this period, is of course the concept and the issue of limited literacy. Now, literacy in this period was confined to ecclesiastical servants, those people who worked for the church, which of course resulted in the preponderance of Old English literature dedicated to religious themes alone. So that's why we have a lot of religious books being published, but unfortunately, not a lot of non religious or secular books survived this period. When we talk about Old English poetry, well, German heroic poetry really stands out prominently. So we have to talk about it. Now, something else which I also want to talk about here is that book and manuscript production was expensive in this period, and that's why only churches had the power and the money to produce books, and that's probably why not a lot of people were able to write and publish their works, nor were a lot of people able to read books, of course, because books and manuscripts were not really popular. So, German heroic poetry was performed orally and it was performed in alliterative verse. Now, alliterative verse, like unlike metric formulas, this kind of poetry uses alliteration to create rhythm and melody. Now, this genre is primarily concerned with everyday events, and it could be like exemplified by works like the Battle of Maldon, which of course commemorated a Viking victory. Now, we also have another important work from this period called the Battle of Brunanburh, and it celebrates an English triumph over the Danes in the 10th century, and we talked about it. These works serve as conduits, and they reflect the heroic and the kinship values which were like inherent in Germanic societies. So this is really important for us. Two of the most dominant themes of Germanic heroic poetry is, of course, the heroic and kinship values. They care so much about heroism, and they also care about kinship. Let me give you an example. So, if you have a family member killed by someone, because kinship values are important for them, it is imperative that you seek revenge because he was your blood brother, for instance. So, heroism and, of course, kinship values are extremely important for these German heroic poetry. Another important noteworthy conflict, especially the one faced by the poets of this era, is the fact that they were torn between Christian and pagan cultures of their Germanic predecessors. So they kind of still had a high place in their heart and minds for their pagan predecessors, but because they had converted to Christianity, they wanted to kind of reconcile the two sets of values, which could be conflicting. Now, a prime example of this is, of course, the Beowulf poet, who navigates the realm of pagan ideals, heroic codes, and, of course, Christian teachings. This dual allegiance pervades the literature of the period, posing a central question, which, of course, is the central question of Beowulf as well. How can one remain loyal to both the earthly king and heavenly God at the same time and simultaneously? So that becomes one of the central questions of the poet, one of the central questions that the poets of this period try to address. Now, for Anglo-Saxon poetry, it might be even futile for us to try to find so many differences between these two different types of values. It's probably futile to try to draw a line between where the heroic values end and the Christian values begin, because the best poetry of the period actually crosses this boundary and talks about both of them. So it's important for us to keep that in mind, that this kind of poetry tries to keep the balance. Now, another important quality of Old English poetry is that it's often elegiac. So, again, if you don't know what an elegy is, it's usually a very sad and somber and a very serious kind of poem, usually written by someone who is contemplating serious issues in life, like, for example, death. So, elegiac undertones permeate Old English poetry, characterized by a somber tone that contemplates profound philosophical issues or laments the life of a friend or a family member. Now, it's important for us to keep in mind that romantic love, of course, which is a central theme in later literature, is conspicuously absent from Old English poetry. Most of the people who are present in these poems, they celebrate, especially when they are victorious. But even in moments of celebration, this poetry reflects contemplation on serious issues. For example, the characters always think about war, and issues like war and failure occupy the minds of the protagonists of these poetry. But of course, despite this potential darkness, the poet skillfully evokes the return of the spring, which is a common trope in this kind of poetry, and it's a recurring motif that, of course, lends the touch of optimism even to the bleakest moments. Let's talk about some of the other characteristic features of Old English poetry. Now, you can take a look at these texts, which I have captured from the Norton Anthology of English Literature. This particular screenshot here tells you that tells you about some of the literary devices that enrich Old English poetic productions, such as, for example, a synecdoche, a metonymy, and kenning, which is the use of compound words for easy ideas. As you can see, there are examples here. Personification is also present in the Old English poetry, as well as, of course, alliteration, because, well, in general, it's alliterative verse. The overall effect of Old English poetry is the use of formal and dignified language. That's also really, really important. And this creates a stark contrast with the everyday language of the Anglo-Saxons. So keep in mind that the poetry produced in this period is actually very, very different from the ordinary language of people, because poets were deliberately trying to be formal, and they tried to use dignified language. Irony also emerges as a prevalent device, adding nuance and complexity to the narratives. So these are some of the characteristic features of Old English poetry. So, just to conclude, as this analysis of Anglo-Saxon poetry comes to a conclusion, it is evident for all of us right now that Old English poetry achieves its impact through the elevation of language and, of course, the skillful use of literary devices, which I just enumerated for you. Now, this initial session laid the groundwork for, of course, future discussions as well. And so I hope that you have learned some information about the works which were produced in the Anglo-Saxon period and some of the most important historical events that took place in this period. Once again, I told you in the introductory video last week that we have to go through all of the important historical events of the period and talk about the general qualities of this period before we delve deeper into the literary works which were produced in this period. So now we have talked about Old English poetry and the Anglo-Saxon period. Our next video will be about the Anglo-Norman period. And of course, the one after that will be about the Middle English period. And after we have covered all these three different periods in one session, which will probably be a long session, we will select some of the most important works from each period and we will talk about them in greater detail. And this brings my presentation today to a conclusion. If you liked the video, please don't forget to like it and just comment something for me. And please don't forget to share the video with your friends as well. So stay tuned. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe and enable the notification bell so that you don't miss the future videos. Thank you very much for watching the video, and I'll see you guys next week when we talk about the Anglo-Norman literature. So until then, take care and bye-bye.